In the early years of World War II, before the skies were filled with bombers and rockets, war was still being fought up close, with men, machines, and whatever weapons they could carry. Among the British Expeditionary Force in 1940, one weapon stood out, not for its beauty, nor for its practicality, but for its sheer size and strange design. It was the Boys anti-tank rifle, a massive bolt-action gun nearly 5 feet long, firing heavy .55 caliber rounds designed to pierce armor. When German troops captured hundreds of these rifles during the fall of France, their engineers at first laughed. To them, it looked primitive, a relic of another era. They joked that it was more likely to break a soldier's shoulder than destroy a tank. But what they didn't know was that this clumsy British weapon had a purpose that went beyond its crude appearance. It was born in desperation, forged from Britain's fear of being overrun by German armor. The rifle was simple, brutal, and functional. It was designed to be built quickly, maintained in the field, and used by men who often had little time to train. Its armor-piercing bullets could penetrate early Panzer I and II tanks at close range, a shocking revelation to the Germans who tested it later. When the first captured Boys rifles were sent to the German weapons testing ground at Kummersdorf, engineers couldn't help but mock it. They compared it to their own precision rifles, finely machined, complex, elegant. The Boys rifle, by contrast, looked industrial, rough, as if someone had bolted a cannon to a rifle stock. But as they disassembled it, their laughter began to fade. Inside, the mechanism was simple but clever. The recoil-operated design absorbed much of the enormous force generated by its massive rounds. The weapon's construction reflected Britain's manufacturing reality, not the precision of peacetime, but the urgency of survival. In testing, the engineers mounted the rifle on a bipod and aimed it at captured tank armor plates. The first shot echoed across the range. The bullet struck, leaving a small dent but no penetration. More laughter followed, until the second round fired. This time the armor plate cracked. The third shot went straight through. Silence followed. The laughter had stopped. For the first time, German engineers realized that even the crudest weapons could be dangerous when used with resolve. They had underestimated British ingenuity, and soon they would learn just how wrong they were. When word reached the higher ranks of the Wehrmacht that the captured British rifle could pierce early Panzer armor, disbelief spread among the officers. They had dismissed the weapon as little more than an oversized hunting gun, a toy compared to German engineering. But the tests at Kummersdorf told a different story. The British Boys rifle, crude as it looked, had achieved what many lighter anti-tank weapons failed to do. It could disable a tank if the shot struck true. German engineers intensified their study. They began comparing the Boys rifle's design to their own anti-tank weapons, such as the Panzerbuchs 38 and 39. The similarities were striking. The concept was the same, a single-shot or magazine-fed rifle firing armor-piercing ammunition meant to stop light armor at close range. But the British rifle was sturdier, better balanced for sustained fire, and most importantly, more reliable in the field. In their reports, German officers noted that the British had sacrificed refinement for function. Every piece of the rifle could be replaced quickly. The bolt was easy to clean. The recoil system, though heavy, absorbed shock better than anything they had designed. And unlike the German Panzerbuchsen, which often jammed after several rounds, the Boys rifle kept firing, even under mud and cold. At short ranges, the weapon was deadly. Its .55 caliber bullet, a massive steel-cored projectile, could punch through nearly 20 millimeters of armor. Against light tanks, scout cars, or half-tracks, it was devastating. British infantry had used it to disable the tracks and engines of approaching German armor during the Battle of France. It didn't destroy tanks in the cinematic sense, no explosions or fireballs, but it immobilized them, and in war, that was often enough. As the test continued, the laughter at Kummersdorf faded completely. Engineers began to take notes, sketching diagrams, measuring the bore, the recoil assembly, and the ammunition design. They were learning from their enemy, and in doing so, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Germany had believed that technological superiority alone would guarantee victory. But here was proof that simplicity, mass production, and functionality could be just as dangerous. The British rifle was ugly, yes, but it worked. By the end of 1940, the Wehrmacht's engineers had added the Boys rifle to their official register of captured weapons, giving it a new name, the 13,9 mm Panzerabwehrbüchse 782E. They began issuing it to rear-line troops and even used captured stocks on the Eastern Front, where Soviet light tanks still fell within its lethal range. What had started as a weapon of ridicule became a tool of respect, a reminder that in war, victory did not always belong to the most elegant design, but to the one that simply got the job done. By 1941, the German engineers at Kummersdorf had turned the captured British Boys rifle into a subject of fascination. The reports circulating within the Wehrmacht's Weapons Bureau described it as unsophisticated yet effective. The rifle's design seemed almost crude compared to the precision machinery of German firearms, but that simplicity was exactly what made it work. When the engineers began live-fire testing against newer armored targets, the results surprised them again. At ranges of less than 100 meters, the .55 caliber armor-piercing bullet could still penetrate 21 millimeters of steel, enough to cripple half-tracks, armored cars, and even the thinner armor of early Panzer I and II models. It wasn't a tank killer by modern standards, but it was more than capable of making life miserable for a crew caught unprepared. German technicians noted that the bullet's velocity, nearly 900 meters per second, gave it immense stopping power. They tested it on sloped armor, engine covers, and even ammunition racks. When fired into weaker points, the projectile caused internal damage through spalling, fragments of metal ricocheting inside the tank compartment. The engineers realized that even a non-lethal hit could disable a vehicle by destroying key systems or injuring the crew. As the tests continued, some German officers began to reassess their own small arms doctrine. They had invested heavily in complex anti-tank rifles, only to discover that those weapons were often too delicate for field use. The British, on the other hand, had created something rugged, mass-produced, and easy to operate, a weapon meant for soldiers, not engineers. Reports from the front confirmed this. German troops fighting in North Africa encountered Boys rifles in the hands of British and Commonwealth troops. Accounts describe trucks, supply vehicles, and lightly armored reconnaissance cars disabled by single, well-placed shots. The weapon's effectiveness in ambushes was undeniable. Even General Erwin Rommel's staff mentioned the rifle's destructive potential in after-action reports from 1941. But what struck the German analysts most was not its power, it was the idea behind it. The Boys rifle symbolized a philosophy foreign to the German way of war. It was not meant to be perfect. It was meant to be enough, a simple, effective tool that gave ordinary infantrymen a fighting chance against armor. By late 1941, German workshops had begun refurbishing captured examples, rebarreling some to use their own 13.2 millimeter ammunition. These modified rifles were issued to occupation forces and rear units, particularly in the Balkans and on the Eastern Front. Ironically, the weapon that the Germans once mocked as a British curiosity had now become part of their arsenal. The engineers at Kummersdorf wrote their final assessment with an unexpected tone of respect. One line stood out among the notes. Not all victories of design come from innovation. Some come from the courage to build what works, even when it looks absurd. By 1942, the Boys rifle had traveled far beyond British lines, captured, copied, and studied by every major power it faced. For the Germans, it had gone from a subject of ridicule to a practical weapon used by their own troops in secondary theaters. At the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, engineers continued to dissect the weapon, intrigued not only by its power, but by its simplicity of manufacture. In a war where the German armaments industry struggled to keep pace with Allied production, the Boys rifle was a symbol of something unsettling, industrial efficiency that Germany could not match. The rifle's components were made with standardized fittings, its barrel could be replaced in the field, and its ammunition, the .55 caliber cartridge, was mass-produced with incredible consistency. The Germans were accustomed to craftsmanship, weapons that demanded careful machining and maintenance. The British had built a tool of war that needed neither. It was ugly, heavy, and awkward to fire, but it could be assembled by factory workers who had never handled a rifle before. That philosophy, practicality over perfection, was alien to the German mindset, yet they could not deny its results. In the occupied territories, reports began to surface of German troops using captured boys' rifles against partisans and light armor. In the Balkans, a handful of Wehrmacht anti-tank detachments used them to ambush Allied supplied vehicles. In the Soviet Union, where German forces faced countless armored threats, these rifles became improvised stopgaps. A strange reversal of fortune for a weapon once mocked in German briefings. One field report described how a boy's rifle was used to disable a Soviet T-60 light tank by firing into its exposed vision slit. Another detailed its use against supply trucks and artillery tractors, where the armor-piercing rounds tore through engine blocks with ease. The engineers noted these findings with quiet fascination. The rifle's crude design was proving to be a small but persistent thorn in their enemy's side, and, occasionally, a useful tool for themselves. Back in Berlin, the Ordnance Office reviewed the findings. The conclusion was pragmatic but humbling. The boy's anti-tank rifle fulfills its role despite its simplicity, a weapon not of genius but of practicality. This realization hinted at a broader truth, that the war was shifting. Germany, with all its precision and design superiority, was being overwhelmed by the sheer industrial might and adaptability of its enemies. The boy's rifle, a small weapon by comparison, was a symbol of that balance tipping. To the engineers at Kummersdorf, the British rifle became a kind of lesson in humility. They had learned to respect what they once dismissed. For a moment, even the most dedicated designers of the Reich's armaments saw beyond national pride and recognized the raw, effective logic of simplicity. They had laughed at it when they first saw it, but now, after thousands of rounds fired and endless hours of testing, that laughter had faded, replaced by something else: reluctant admiration. By the middle of 1942, the German engineers had drawn their conclusions about the British boy's rifle. But curiosity lingered. They wanted to understand how such a crude, oversized weapon could still deliver results in combat. In their eyes, it wasn't just a rifle anymore. It was a case study in how a nation fought its wars. At Kummersdorf, tests continued under varied conditions. They fired the boy's rifle in freezing temperatures, in sand, and even submerged it partially in mud to simulate the brutal realities of war. Each time the weapon fired, it jammed occasionally, its bolt heavy and stubborn, but it never failed entirely. The engineers began to note its durability in their reports. A quiet admission that British designers had built something for the worst possible conditions. The Germans also examined the ammunition more closely. The .55 caliber Boys cartridge. It was larger than most small arms rounds and used a hardened steel core designed to punch through metal rather than flesh. Against early tanks, it could penetrate nearly 20 millimeters of armor at 300 yards. That might not seem like much by 1942 standards, but in 1940, it had been enough to turn light armor into death traps. To understand the weapon's place in history, the Germans revisited their early war encounters. During the Battle of France, their Panzer I and II tanks had been lightly armored, vulnerable even to large-caliber rifles. British expeditionary troops armed with the boy's rifle had used it effectively in the opening stages, ambushing armored columns, destroying fuel trucks, and forcing the Germans to upgrade their vehicles. Now, in hindsight, the engineers saw a strange irony. The very weapon they mocked had directly contributed to the evolution of their own tank designs. But what intrigued the German ordnance officers most wasn't its early success. It was how the British had accepted its limitations and moved on. By 1942, the boy's rifle was being phased out of British service, replaced by the more efficient PIAT launcher. Yet the weapon's story didn't end there. It continued to serve in secondary roles, mounted on vehicles, used by partisans, even supplied to resistance groups across occupied Europe. For the Germans, this adaptability was remarkable. A weapon they saw as obsolete had found new life everywhere, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Norway. It spoke volumes about Allied pragmatism. Nothing went to waste, and every tool could serve a purpose. At Kummersdorf, the engineers filed their final assessment. The report was concise yet revealing. It concluded, the British Boys Rifle demonstrates effective use of industrial design to fulfill a short-term tactical need. It is not elegant, but it is reliable. It embodies their philosophy. Function above form. Those words, written in the language of their enemy, were as much an acknowledgement as they were a warning. Germany was fighting nations that built weapons to win wars, not to impress engineers. In a time when every weapon was a reflection of the country that built it, the boys' rifle became something unexpected. A mirror. To the Germans, it reflected not British ingenuity, but the uncomfortable truth that victory favored those who built not the best machines, but the most practical ones. By the time the German tests of the boys' rifle concluded, the engineers had come to a reluctant respect for its simplicity. But as the war evolved, so too did the weapons, and the lessons the Germans drew from them. The boys' rifle was no longer a threat to their heavy tanks, yet it remained a reminder of how quickly the balance of power could shift when ingenuity replaced arrogance. In 1943, reports from the Eastern Front arrived at the Kummersdorf proving grounds. Soviet troops, too, were using anti-tank rifles, notably the PTRD and PTRS, massive, unwieldy weapons firing high-velocity rounds capable of piercing early Panzer armor. The Germans saw in those Soviet rifles the same principle that had once guided the British. Make something simple, cheap, and effective enough to serve until something better arrived. The engineers realized that while they had spent years perfecting complex tank designs and precision weaponry, their enemies had embraced functionality. Where the Germans prized perfection, the Allies and Soviets prioritized production, and that difference they began to understand was shaping the war. Some of the same officers who had mocked the British boys' rifle began to study its engineering in earnest. They took particular interest in its recoil mechanism, a long spring-dampened bolt that absorbed part of the weapon's violent kick. That design, crude as it was, later influenced components tested for lightweight anti-armor prototypes. And though the weapon itself was soon outdated, its concept, man-portable armor penetration, remained vital. From that idea, entire new generations of weapons would evolve, culminating in the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, designs that prioritized battlefield practicality over elegance. One German engineer reportedly remarked during these studies, "We laughed at the rifle that hurt the man who fired it, but perhaps pain is the price of power." For all its physical brutality, the boys' rifle had a psychological effect too. Captured soldiers often admitted they feared facing it more than most other infantry weapons early in the war. The weapon's deep, echoing blast and distinctive metallic crack became infamous across Europe, a sound that, to German tank crews in 1940, meant danger was near. Even when its ability to penetrate armor diminished, that sound still carried weight. It symbolized defiance. The idea that even a single soldier could fight steel with steel and live. By 1944, when German engineers revisited their old evaluation files, they viewed the boys' rifle differently. They no longer saw it as a clumsy relic of desperation. Instead, they saw it as one of the early roots of a new kind of warfare, one where individuals with simple portable weapons could threaten machines far larger and more powerful than themselves. This shift in perception wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. It represented a recognition that war was changing, moving away from massive formations and toward mobility, improvisation, and adaptability. The rifle that had once drawn laughter in Kummersdorf had helped define an entirely new era of battlefield thinking. And though few German officers would ever admit it publicly, the British had achieved something the Reich rarely could. They had built a weapon that didn't need to be perfect, only to work when it mattered most. As the war dragged on and the Allies advanced, the lessons learned from captured weapons became more than academic. The Germans, now on the defensive, found themselves studying everything they once mocked, from Soviet anti-tank rifles to British and American innovations. But the boys' rifle remained a strange case in those archives, a weapon that had been outdated almost as soon as it appeared, yet one that left an impression impossible to ignore. In early 1944, a team of engineers revisited the Kummersdorf reports while searching for ways to improve infantry anti-tank options. Germany was desperate. Its tanks were unmatched in power, but its infantry increasingly lacked portable defenses against Allied armor. The Panzerfaust had entered mass production, a marvel of simplicity, yet it carried risks of its own, short range and high danger to the user. The old files on the British Boys rifle were reopened, and once again, German analysts discussed its strengths. They noted the craftsmanship of its machining, the effectiveness of its steel penetrator ammunition, and the rifle's shocking accuracy at medium range. One report concluded, "It is crude but honest. Its purpose is clear and it fulfills it. In this, it is superior to many of our own designs, which aim for perfection but fail in simplicity." For the British, the Boys rifle was a symbol of the early war's desperation, a weapon that embodied the courage of ordinary soldiers forced to stand against tanks with little else. For the Germans, it became something different, a mirror reflecting their own design philosophy back at them. It showed them that innovation was not always born from complexity, that sometimes survival depended on what could be produced and deployed fastest. Across the front lines, German troops still occasionally encountered the Boys rifle, though by this point it had been largely replaced by the PIAT, a spring-launched shape-charge projector far deadlier than the older weapon. Yet veterans remembered the first time they faced it, the way its thunderous report had seemed to tear through the air like a cannon blast from the hands of a single man. Captured British soldiers, when questioned, often spoke of the rifle with mixed pride and pain. It was heavy, punishing, and often unreliable. Yet when it worked, it gave them confidence. That confidence, the Germans realized, was part of the weapon's real power. The Boys rifle was not just metal and mechanics, it was morale forged into steel. It gave men the illusion, and sometimes the reality, that they could fight back against impossible odds. For the German engineers, that idea lingered. In the final years of the war, as factories crumbled under Allied bombing and supplies vanished, they began producing weapons that mirrored the spirit of the Boys rifle: crude, improvised, effective. Weapons like the Volkssturmgewehr and Panzerfaust were born not from pride, but from necessity. What had once been mocked now became the guiding principle of a dying war machine. Build what works, not what impresses. In this way, the legacy of the Boys rifle lived on, not in the weapon itself, but in the realization it forced upon those who once dismissed it. Sometimes the simplest weapons teach the hardest lessons. By 1945, the once mighty German war machine was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. Cities were reduced to rubble, oil was scarce, and the Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies was now nearly grounded. Yet deep within the remnants of the Wehrmacht's engineering corps, those who had studied the captured Boys rifle remembered its brutal honesty, and they quietly admired it. At the proving grounds in Hillersleben, engineers continued testing captured weapons long after the front had moved far beyond them. Reports survived the chaos, handwritten, sometimes smudged by soot or oil. One engineer described the British rifle in terms both technical and oddly poetic. "It is a weapon that does not ask for perfection, only courage from the man who fires it." That line would later appear in post-war studies written by Allied intelligence, who discovered these documents after Germany's surrender. For the Allies, it was a strange vindication, proof that even the enemy had come to respect a weapon they themselves had long abandoned. To understand the context, one must remember the desperate times in which it was used. The Boys rifle entered service in 1937, designed before tanks had truly become the monsters of steel they would be by 1942. Against the thin armor of early German Panzer I and II tanks, it had been devastating. At Dunkirk, it knocked out scout cars and light tanks. In Norway, it proved surprisingly effective in ambushes through snow and rock. But the tide turned fast. When heavier armor appeared, Panzer IVs, Tigers, Panthers, the .55 caliber rifle round simply bounced off. By the time of the North African campaign, it was obsolete in name, though still carried in numbers. Yet the courage of those who fired it never faded. The Germans had laughed when they first examined the weapon. Its awkward shape, its punishing recoil, its crude bipod. But when they saw what it could do to a tank's vision port or track at 300 yards, the laughter stopped. They realized that behind the seemingly primitive design lay an understanding of battlefield reality. Infantry needed something, anything, to fight armor. When Germany tested the boys' rifle, they compared it to their own Panzerbüchse 1939. Technically, the German weapon had a faster projectile and slightly better penetration, but the British rifle's larger bore and simpler operation made it far easier to maintain in the field. Even its awkward bulk had a strange advantage. It could withstand abuse that would ruin lighter rifles. When Allied intelligence teams moved into Germany in 1945, they found remnants of these test weapons locked away in steel crates, each labeled Beutewaffen, captured arms. Among them were at least a dozen boys' rifles, still oiled, still cared for. Some had been repurposed for training, others used for experiments in anti-material sniping. The irony was hard to ignore. The weapon that once symbolized Allied weakness had become a lesson in functional strength. It showed that true engineering was not about perfection, it was about purpose. The German engineers who had laughed at it were now working under Allied supervision, many of them soon to help rebuild Europe. For them, the boys' rifle remained a curious reminder of how arrogance had blinded them to practicality. One of them later wrote, "We believe power came from complexity. The British rifle proved us wrong. Power came from will, from the man who refuses to surrender, even when outmatched." And in that single truth, the story of the boys' rifle became something larger than steel and ballistics. It became a story of war's ultimate lesson, that ingenuity, courage, and necessity can turn even the most underestimated weapon into a legend. As the war drew to its bitter end, the remnants of Germany's weapons testing programs fell into Allied hands. Among the recovered documents were evaluations of captured arms, rifles, grenades, rocket launchers, each analyzed in chilling detail. But one report stood out, stamped "Secret, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht." It was the final technical assessment of the British boys' anti-tank rifle. The report began almost mockingly, calling the rifle an outdated curiosity. Yet as it continued, the tone shifted. Paragraph by paragraph, the engineers documented its unexpected strengths, its simplicity, its ruggedness, its raw power against early armor. One note written in the margin by a German officer read, "Not elegant, but effective. The kind of weapon a desperate soldier needs." That statement summarized what the Germans had come to respect. Not the rifle's engineering, but its philosophy. It was a weapon born of necessity, not prestige. Built for the common infantryman, not the elite. In that way, it mirrored the spirit of the British Army itself. The Allies had long since retired the boys' rifle by 1945, replacing it with the PIAT and the American bazooka. But in many corners of the world, the weapon lived on. In Finland, it was still used against Soviet tanks well into the late stages of the war. In the Pacific, it proved useful against bunkers, trucks, and even small boats. It was no longer an anti-tank rifle. It had become an all-purpose tool of survival. German engineers recognized this adaptability with a mix of envy and disbelief. In their factories, weapons were becoming more advanced but also more fragile, dependent on precision machining, rare alloys, and constant maintenance. The British rifle, by contrast, could be dragged through mud, snow, or sand and still fire. It was this very adaptability that made the boys' rifle a subject of study for post-war weapons designers. The Soviets, the Americans, and even the Germans who later worked in Allied design bureaus took note. Its heavy barrel, oversized bolt, and simplistic mechanism were crude, but they embodied something essential: durability under fire. When future anti-material rifles like the Barrett or the Soviet PTRD were examined decades later, historians found echoes of the boys' rifle's design logic. It was not the same weapon, but the same idea: a tool for soldiers facing impossible odds. In post-war Germany, surviving engineers were interviewed by Allied intelligence teams. One, a former weapons specialist from the Heereswaffenamt, described the experience of firing the boys' rifle during trials. "It bruised your shoulder, deafened your ears, and kicked like a mule. But it worked. You could feel its intent, as if it was built by men who knew what desperation felt like." That honesty struck the Allied interrogators. For once, the enemy wasn't boasting about superior design or innovation. He was acknowledging something deeper, respect for a simple, brutal weapon that refused to fail. As the world began to rebuild, the boy's rifle quietly faded into history. Many were melted down, scrapped for steel, or left to rust in forgotten depots. But in military archives, its story endured. A story that reminded future generations of what mattered most in war: reliability, courage, and the will to endure. For the German engineers who once laughed at it, the weapon became a quiet symbol of humility. In its simplicity, they saw everything their own designs had lost: humanity, practicality, and the acknowledgement that not every victory comes from superiority. In the end, the boy's rifle did not win the war, nor did it change its course, but it earned something far rarer: the respect of those it was meant to destroy. When the war finally ended, the world was left divided, not just by ideology or borders, but by the lessons it had learned through fire and ruin. Among the many forgotten weapons of that era, the British boy's anti-tank rifle stood as an unlikely teacher, a relic of human determination and industrial pragmatism. In 1946, Allied intelligence compiled a massive catalog of captured Axis research. Hidden among thousands of technical documents were pages devoted to foreign weapons analysis. The German section on the boy's rifle was concise but telling. It stated, "Obsolete in theory, dangerous in practice." That paradox summarized exactly why it had impressed them. In the early days of the war, German soldiers had dismissed it entirely. Their Panzer I and II tanks, lightly armored but fast, shrugged off the boy's rounds at a distance. They laughed at its recoil, its size, its primitive design. But as armor evolved and engagements grew desperate, the rifle found new life in the hands of determined soldiers across multiple fronts, from the sands of North Africa to the frozen forests of Finland. The Germans who tested the weapon firsthand admitted that their own army never would have produced such a tool. They believed in precision, complexity, and efficiency, values that served them well, but also limited their adaptability. The British, by contrast, approached war like a craftsman, using what they had, improving what they could, and trusting in rugged simplicity. One engineer later wrote, "We thought of war as an equation. They treated it as survival." For the men who used it, the boy's rifle became more than just a weapon. It was a lifeline. To the defenders of Calais and Tobruk, it was a chance to fight back against steel monsters that otherwise could not be stopped. For the Germans who faced it, it was a reminder that ingenuity often hides behind the least assuming designs. In time, the rifle's legend faded. The PIAT replaced it, then the bazooka, and finally more advanced rocket launchers and anti-tank missiles made such weapons obsolete. But its legacy endured quietly, not in museums, but in the design philosophies that shaped post-war military engineering. Strength through simplicity, reliability over refinement. Decades later, historians reviewing German weapons reports found themselves struck by a strange consistency. Time and again, captured Allied equipment, from tanks to aircraft to infantry weapons, was described in the same way: unsophisticated but effective. It was perhaps the greatest compliment their enemies could have given them. For the boy's rifle, that sentiment was especially true. It was crude, heavy, and outdated, yet it embodied something profoundly human. It was proof that even the simplest idea, in the hands of determined men, could stand against overwhelming odds. When German engineers fired the boy's rifle for the first time, they laughed. When they saw it punch through armor, they fell silent. And when the war was over, they remembered it, not as a masterpiece of design, but as a symbol of the will to resist. The rifle had no elegance, no grace, no legend carved into its frame, but like the men who carried it, it endured, against tanks, against mockery, and against time itself. In the end, history remembers the great machines, the Tigers, the Spitfires, the Shermans, but hidden beneath their shadows are weapons like the boy's rifle, crude, loud, uncelebrated, yet essential. It was a weapon of ordinary men facing impossible odds, and that, perhaps, is what made it extraordinary. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.